The auditorium shone with the metallic gleam of spotlights as journalists from around the world waited eagerly for the big announcement. On stage, a giant screen displayed futuristic images of cities powered by a clean, endless energy source. Flags of various nations waved in the background, symbolizing the promise of a new era. All eyes were on the central figure, Tiago Lopez, the charismatic billionaire who commanded the scene. He walked with confident strides, a calculated smile on his face, his eyes sparkling with self-assurance. The audience leaned forward as he began to speak, his deep, imposing voice filling the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future, the solar reactor," he announced with theatrical flair. A bright hologram appeared above the stage, showing the revolutionary technology in action. People applauded, some rising to their feet, amazed by the promise of solving the energy crisis. Cameras captured every gesture, every word, broadcasting it live to billions. In that moment, Tiago became the face of global hope. The reactor promised clean, affordable, and limitless energy. It was the utopia scientists had been searching for decades, and now it seemed within reach. Newspapers would run historic headlines the next day. Tiago Lopez saves the world. Politicians and investors were thrilled, thinking about the economic and social impact. But behind that glorious narrative lay dark secrets, buried under contracts, bought silences, and unexplained disappearances. As the crowd marveled, Tiago allowed himself to savor the triumph. With every applause, he remembered the obstacles he had overcome to get there. "The world will finally recognize me as the greatest visionary of the century," he thought, adjusting the microphone. It was the culmination of a life marked by relentless ambition. Little did he know that at that very moment, a simple child's voice, far away, was about to shake the very foundations of his empire. In a distant suburb, in a modest living room, Joaquim's family was watching the press conference on television. The screen lit up the small space, reflecting in the curious eyes of the 5-year-old boy. Sitting on the couch, he swung his feet in the air, not understanding the grandeur of the event. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he saw the hologram projecting drawings of the reactor. The boy stood up quickly, pointing his finger at the TV. "Look, Mom, that's Grandpa Pedro's drawing," he exclaimed with innocent joy. The sound hit the silent room like a bomb. His mother turned pale, bringing her hand to her mouth, unable to respond immediately. His father stopped breathing for a second, a chill running down his spine. How could a child connect a multi-billion-dollar project to a grandfather who had vanished years ago?
At first, the boy's words seemed like just a product of a child's imagination, but the coincidences were just too strong. Joaquim ran to a drawer and brought back some yellowed pages covered in scribbles that were identical to the designs projected on the screen. "See, it's exactly the same," he said, showing off the original sketches he kept as a family treasure. His mother's heart was pounding. Back at the press conference, as camera flashes went off, Tiago Lopez was proudly presenting his innovations. On the other side of the screen, little Joaquim was holding up Pedro's drawings as silent proof of a colossal lie. Fate, in a twist of irony, had chosen a child to be the messenger of the truth. And so, at the very same moment the billionaire was being applauded as a savior, his downfall was being set in motion, not by powerful enemies, but by the purity of a boy who had simply recognized his beloved grandfather's handiwork. What was innocence to him would become the start of a scandal capable of shaking empires to their core. And if you also believe that hidden secrets can change a billionaire's destiny, subscribe to the channel now. That way you won't miss the next thrilling stories that will keep you hooked until the very end. The news spread quickly on social media. A journalist who was watching the press conference in Joaquim's living room didn't let the boy's comments slide. Marina, an investigative reporter, immediately recorded the scene with her phone, capturing the exact moment the boy pointed at the TV and spoke about his grandfather. To her, that detail felt like the tip of a forgotten thread, ready to be pulled. The next morning, Marina watched the video over and over. She compared the sketches Joaquim had shown with public images of Tiago's reactor. The resemblance was striking. How could a child know those designs? And why connect them to Pedro, the scientist who had disappeared years ago, under circumstances that were never explained? The reporter felt she was on to the biggest story of her career. Meanwhile, Joaquim went about his day like any other child, unaware of the significance of what he had said. For him, he had simply recognized the drawings his grandfather had shown him so many times during their loving conversations before he mysteriously vanished. For his mother, however, the memory of her father reopened old wounds. Tears streamed down her face as she gently touched the yellowed papers, fearing what might come to light. Marina decided to visit the family and asked for permission to talk. She was met with caution, but the sincerity in her eyes broke through their initial distrust. Sitting at their simple kitchen table, she listened to the story of Pedro's disappearance years ago when he left for a conference and never returned. The police had closed the case as a voluntary disappearance, but no one in the family had ever believed that version. "He would never have abandoned Joaquim, never," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Marina recorded every detail, realizing that the boy's cherished sketches were the key to a hidden puzzle. The more she listened, the more she became certain that there was a dark connection between Tiago and the scientist's disappearance.
Across town, Tiago was enjoying his moment of glory. Meetings with investors, invitations from world leaders, and triumphant headlines filled his schedule. But somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a nagging echo. The designs, so familiar, brought back memories he would rather forget. He had erased Pedro from the world, but he never imagined the scientist's ghost could return through the voice of a child. Marina wrote her first article, hinting that Lopez's project might have shady origins. She didn't mention Joaquim directly, but left enough clues to spark curiosity. The story went viral within hours, sparking heated debates. On one side were the billionaire's defenders. On the other, voices demanding transparency. Cracks were beginning to show in Tiago's empire. With every click on the article, Marina knew she was drawing the attention of powerful people, and not all of them had good intentions. But her thirst for the truth was greater than her fear. Pedro's disappearance would no longer be a forgotten case. Joaquim, without meaning to, had lit the fuse. And so, a little boy's innocent revelation became the spark for a war between truth and lies. A war that, without his knowledge, would determine not only his own future, but also the destiny of all of humanity. Marina stayed up all night reviewing old documents about Pedro and his brilliant career. The scientist had been considered one of the greatest visionaries of his generation, but he had vanished without a trace. Cold, inconclusive police reports called it a voluntary disappearance, but to her, it smelled like a cover-up. The inconsistencies were glaring. A man devoted to his family just disappears, and the case is closed that quickly? Something was wrong. She dove into academic archives, scientific publications, and old patents. She found repeated mentions of the solar project, Pedro's pioneering idea that was never completed. Comparing the records, Marina realized the fundamentals were identical to those presented by Tiago. Her heart raced. This was more than a coincidence. She was looking at a possible historic theft. As she investigated, the image of Joaquim pointing at the TV wouldn't leave her mind. He was the piece that connected the past and the present in a simple yet devastating way. A child with no guile wouldn't have made it up. Marina decided to talk to the family again, convinced the sketches were the missing key. She needed to confirm details, hear their memories, and connect the dots. The visit was emotional. Pedro's daughter opened an old box filled with the scientist's documents, letters, and notes. The smell of aged paper and faded ink brought back painful memories. Among the papers,
Marina found sketches almost identical to the ones Tiago had presented. The similarity was so clear, any expert would recognize the fraud. Marina photographed everything, saving digital copies in secure locations. She knew she was dealing with powerful forces, capable of permanently silencing anyone who threatened their secrets. Still, her determination only grew. "If I have to, I will take on this empire," she murmured to herself, closing the box. This was more than journalism. It was about justice.
Meanwhile, Tiago quietly took note of the fallout from the articles suggesting plagiarism. His communications team tried to downplay it, calling it a conspiracy theory. However, more attentive journalists began to question why there was never any clear proof that the reactor was actually his own creation. Doubt was starting to eat away at the billionaire's image. Tiago called an urgent meeting with his board of directors. Nervous, he demanded absolute control over the media and the monitoring of investigative journalists. "We can't let this narrative gain traction," he said, slamming his hand on the table. But deep down, his conscience was tormenting him. He knew Pedro was the true mind behind the reactor, and he also knew where the scientist was. Marina, for her part, started receiving anonymous phone calls. Some were threatening, others cryptic, with phrases like "stop digging" or "he is still alive." While she felt afraid, she also understood she was getting closer to the truth. It was as if someone on the inside was trying to discreetly help her. Determined, she began planning her next article. This time, she would reveal concrete evidence linking Pedro to the solar reactor. It would be a hard blow against Tiago, but she knew it also meant putting Joaquim and his family at risk. Even so, her decision was made. That night, Marina looked out at the lit-up city and took a deep breath. "If the truth comes with a high price, then so be it," she said quietly. The board was set. On one side, Tiago's billion-dollar empire. On the other, a determined journalist and an innocent child who had unwittingly opened the door to a worldwide scandal. The next day began with Tiago Lopez waking up with a heavy head. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors, international partners, and advisors were demanding explanations. Marina's article had spread like wildfire. Websites and blogs were debating the possibility of plagiarism. He tried to stay calm, but his mind was spinning out of control. With every call, he felt the weight of a truth about to explode. At the next press conference, journalists were already more aggressive. One of them asked directly, "Mr. Lopez, is it true that you appropriated the research of the missing scientist, Pedro Alvarez?" Caught off guard, Tiago stammered for a few seconds before attempting an evasive answer. But it was too late. His initial silence came across as confirmation. The tension in the auditorium grew. Cameras focused on the billionaire's sweaty face, capturing every micro-expression. The audience watched live, noticing his discomfort. Then something unexpected happened. Tiago staggered and fell to the floor, fainting in front of everyone. The sound of cameras and screams filled the room. His moment of glory had turned into a spectacle of weakness. The scene spread around the world in minutes. Headlines read, "Billionaire faints amid fraud accusations." The internet exploded with memes, criticism, and theories. For many, the collapse wasn't just physical, but symbolic. The mask was beginning to slip. Investors started pulling their support, fearing the empire was built on lies. Tiago was rushed to his private office, away from the cameras. As he recovered, he punched the table in fury. "That damned scientist ruined my life, even from off the stage," he yelled. His terrified team tried to calm him, but the fear was palpable. The scandal could no longer be contained with official statements alone. Meanwhile, Marina received messages of support from fellow journalists. The fainting video strengthened her investigation. "We're close to a breakthrough," she thought.
feeling both excited and apprehensive. She knew that from this point on, Tiago would be forced to defend himself more aggressively. That could create openings, but it also brought greater dangers. Tiago began plotting his survival strategy. He ordered his team to hire disinformation experts to tarnish Pedro's and the family's reputation. "If they want a war, they'll get a war," he said with an icy stare. The man once seen as a visionary was finally showing his ruthless side. However, international pressure was mounting. Governments began demanding more transparency, questioning the technology's origins. Even Tiago's longtime allies asked for explanations. The billionaire realized he wasn't just facing one journalist, but a global wave of distrust. Alone in his office, he opened a locked drawer and pulled out a dossier. It contained documents, photos, and confidential reports about Pedro. He stared at a picture of the scientist, still young, with a determined gaze. "You won't destroy me, Pedro," he murmured. But deep down, he felt the battle was already lost. The empire that had taken decades to build was crumbling before his eyes. And it had all started with a child's simple sentence, spoken so innocently that none of his millions could have predicted or bought it.
Marina received an unexpected call on that rainy morning. The voice on the other end was hoarse and anxious. "I have information about Pedro, but we need to meet in person." Before she could respond, the call dropped. Her heart raced. Someone from inside Diego's empire finally wanted to talk. It was confirmation she was on the right track. Following the instructions left for her, Marina went to a discreet downtown cafe. She sat at the indicated table, and minutes later, a middle-aged man with a weary expression approached. He was a former employee of Diego's company who requested anonymity. With trembling hands, he gave her a manila envelope, saying, "Guard this carefully. My life depends on it." Inside the envelope were internal reports, meeting notes, and even old photos. The material suggested Pedro had never truly disappeared, but had been taken to a secret, exclusive research center. Reading between the lines made it clear it was a prison in disguise. Marina read and reread the documents, trying to control the adrenaline rushing through her veins.
The evidence was overwhelming, but still not quite enough to publish. She needed to connect the documents directly to the solar reactor and expose the link to Tiago. At the same time, she knew she was in real danger. "If this man risked his life to get this to me, what's waiting for me now?" she thought. The weight of responsibility grew with each page she read. Meanwhile, Tiago was monitoring the press closely. When he was informed about a leak of internal information, he flew into a rage. He ordered his security team to find the source and silence them immediately. Paranoia took hold, and every employee was now viewed as a potential traitor. His empire, built on trust and loyalty, was starting to unravel. Marina decided to share encrypted copies of the documents with 2 trusted colleagues as a safeguard. "If anything happens to me, the story still gets out," she told them. This gave her some peace of mind, but it didn't reduce the risk. Her name was already on their radar, and she knew it. The footsteps she heard behind her at night no longer felt like a coincidence. As she planned her next move, Marina's thoughts returned to Joaquim. The boy was the spark that started it all. If Tiago discovered the child was involved, he could use it against them. Her fear for the family's safety grew. Even so, turning back was not an option. The world needed to know the truth about Pedro. That night, reviewing the papers under the soft light of a lamp, Marina found an encrypted note. It looked like a partial map indicating the location of the secret lab. She didn't know if it was real or just a distraction, but she decided to take the chance. The fate of her investigation might hinge on deciphering those coordinates. Across the city, Tiago drank expensive whiskey while staring at his reflection in the dark glass of his skyscraper. The world had applauded him as a savior, but now saw him as a potential fraud.
He knew his wall of lies was crumbling, but he still believed that with enough money and influence, he could turn things around. The clash between truth and power was set. With every step Marina took, Thiago's shadow grew more threatening, and the memory of Pedro, held in forced silence, grew stronger. The invisible thread connecting all the players was pulling tighter, like a rope about to snap. Marina's article with the initial evidence gained international traction. Headlines in different languages questioned the origin of the solar reactor. Genius or thief blared a one magazine cover. The pressure on Thiago mounted by the hour, and his image as a visionary began to crumble in the court of public opinion. Thiago reacted by calling an emergency press conference. On stage, surrounded by lawyers and advisors, he tried to deny the accusations. He claimed that jealous enemies wanted to destroy his reputation. But his words sounded rehearsed, and the journalists weren't convinced. Their pointed questions exposed contradictions in his story.
Meanwhile, Marina started receiving threatening messages on her email and phone. Some were direct. "Stop now, or you'll be next." Others were sarcastic, mocking her courage. She took deep breaths, trying not to give in to the fear. With every threat, her determination grew stronger. "If they're trying to silence me, it means I'm on the right track," she thought. The pressure on her intensified. Her home was broken into while she was out, but nothing was stolen. It was just a warning. Drawers rummaged through, furniture moved, and a handwritten note that said, "Last chance." The message was clear: back off or face serious consequences. But Marina wasn't alone. Other journalists began to join her investigation. The video of Joaquim with the sketches was now quietly circulating among press circles, adding weight to the fraud suspicion. This collective pressure increased the impact. Thiago was no longer facing just one reporter, but an entire network of watchful eyes. Inside his company, the mood was tense. Employees whispered in the hallways, afraid to be on the wrong side of history. Rumors that Pedro was still alive spread, creating unease. Loyalty to the billionaire began to crack. Every silence seemed to hide a secret. Every glance carried suspicion. An irritated Thiago decided to fight back more aggressively. He ordered his marketing team to launch campaigns praising his story of overcoming adversity and accusing journalists of conspiring against him. But the attempt felt artificial, and many sensed the desperation. What was once admiration was now turning into distrust. Marina, seizing the moment, published another article. This time, she directly connected Pedro's original sketches to Thiago's project, comparing identical sections. The impact was devastating. Experts began giving interviews confirming the similarity. The case was no longer just a suspicion, it was evidence. Thiago felt the walls closing in. Backed into a corner, he started considering extreme measures. His mind, once brilliant for business, now spun with desperate strategies. "If I can't erase the truth, maybe I need to erase the one who carries it," he thought in a dark silence. The battle between Joaquim's innocence, Marina's persistence, and Thiago's dark power was raging. The world watched, unaware that behind the media spectacle was a man kept in silence, waiting to be freed. Pedro, the true creator of the solar reactor. The pressure on Thiago reached unbearable levels when a TV network secured an exclusive interview with Pedro's family. In the studio, Joaquim appeared smiling, sitting on his mother's lap, holding the yellowed sketches. When the host asked where the drawings came from, the child answered without hesitation, "From Grandpa Pedro. He made them for me." The simplicity of the statement sent millions of viewers into an uproar. The footage went viral in minutes. Comments flooded social media, calling Thiago a fraud and demanding justice. The contrast between a child's purity and a corrupt billionaire's arrogance sparked global outrage. People in different countries protested outside Thiago's company headquarters.
The case was no longer just about science or business, it was about humanity.
Tiago watched the interview from his luxurious penthouse. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand. "That damned kid," he muttered, before hurling the glass against the wall. The sound of shattering glass echoed like a bad omen. He could feel his control slipping through his fingers. No matter how hard he tried to manipulate the narrative, Joaquim's sincere gaze held more power than any rehearsed speech. Meanwhile, Marina pressed on with her investigation, but now she had to protect Pedro's family. She knew the exposure made them a target. She hired private security and worked with international NGOs to arrange safe shelter for them. "They can't pay the price for having spoken the truth," she repeated, worried. Her mission had expanded. It was no longer just about publishing the story, but also about protecting the innocent. The growing attention also stirred Pedro's former colleagues. Scientists from around the world began to speak out, recalling projects he had worked on. They signed petitions demanding explanations for his disappearance and calling for a UN investigation. Pedro's name, once forgotten, re-emerged as a symbol of scientific integrity. In response, Tiago deployed lawyers to try and sue the family for defamation. This legal maneuver, however, was met with public scorn. It was clearly a desperate attempt to silence a child. Even his political allies began to distance themselves, sensing an inevitable downfall. Joaquim, for his part, didn't understand the weight of it all. To him, Grandpa Pedro was just the loving grandfather who told him stories and drew wonderful machines. His innocence, however, was becoming a weapon against the lies. Every word he spoke seemed to shine more light into the billionaire's shadows. Tiago began to lose sleep. He was haunted by dreams of the boy's accusing stare, as if Joaquim knew the whole truth. Paranoia consumed him, and he trusted no one. The hallways of his own company became a maze of suspicion. The steel empire was corroding from the inside out. As Marina prepared her next report, she reflected on how innocence could be more powerful than any weapon. Joaquim didn't make speeches or present technical evidence, but his voice was impossible to silence. Often, the truth had the face of a child. And so, the scales began to tip. The weight of innocence proved stronger than millions of dollars spent on propaganda and manipulation. The world was starting to believe that the true hero was silent, imprisoned somewhere. Pedro, the grandfather whose life's work had been stolen.
The final breaking point came when a group of executives who were disgusted with Tiago decided to act. Meeting in secret, they compiled confidential documents that proved a direct link between Pedro's disappearance and the emergence of the solar reactor. There were forged contracts, suspicious fund transfers, and surveillance reports on the scientist. This was the proof that Tiago hadn't just stolen the idea, he had orchestrated Pedro's vanishing act. One of the executives, risking his own career, contacted Marina. He gave her an encrypted flash drive, saying, "Here is the truth. Use it carefully. He won't forgive whoever exposed this." Marina took a deep breath, thanked him, and guarded the device like gold. This was the missing piece to complete the puzzle. When she opened the files, the journalist found never-before-seen photos of Pedro inside a laboratory. Although aged, he was clearly recognizable. In the background, the branding and logos of Tiago's company made it impossible to deny. The scientist wasn't dead. He was alive, held in a prison disguised as a research center. A chill ran down Marina's spine. This was more than scientific fraud. It was a crime against humanity. The world needed to see those images, but she knew that by publishing them, she would risk not only her own life, but the lives of everyone involved. Even so, there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Tiago was informed about the document leak. His rage was uncontrollable.
He gathered his most trusted team and ordered an internal witch hunt. Employees were fired on the spot, rooms were locked down, servers were wiped. But it was already too late. The truth had escaped from its vault of secrets. Marina devised a coordinated release strategy. If she released the documents alone, it would be easy to attack her credibility. But with the support of international news outlets and independent experts, Tiago would have no way to manipulate the narrative. She organized a network of journalists ready to publish simultaneously. The attack would be devastating. The revelation came on a Sunday night during prime time. Headlines appeared on screens worldwide. Evidence suggests missing scientist is alive and under Tiago Lopez's control. The images of Pedro shook people to their core. Protests erupted in various cities, demanding immediate explanations. Tiago tried to fight back, claiming it was a setup and a conspiracy, but the pressure was unsustainable. Governments announced formal investigations, and international bodies got involved. The protective wall the billionaire had built around himself was crumbling at an accelerating pace. In his penthouse, Tiago broke objects, screamed at subordinates, and cursed Pedro. "I gave you the world, and you dared to challenge me even from captivity?" he roared, delirious with fury. His power was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. And as the conspiracy was exposed to the world, one certainty grew. Pedro's freedom was no longer a matter of if, but when. The net was closing in on the billionaire, and justice was approaching with swift, decisive steps.
Marina could no longer walk the streets freely. Since the evidence had been revealed, she felt like she was being watched on every corner. Black cars parked near her home, and men in dark suits discreetly followed her movements. It was clear Tiago was using every resource available to intimidate her. But the journalists stood her ground, with the documents now distributed to newsrooms around the world. Even if they silenced her, the truth could no longer be contained. One quiet night, as she was heading home, Marina realized someone was following her closely. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the alley. Her heart raced, but she stayed calm. In a quick move, she ducked into a cafe that was still open and pretended to be on a phone call. The man hesitated at the door and then retreated. The danger was real. Knowing she couldn't fight this war alone, Marina sought support from international human rights organizations. She showed them the proof that Pedro was alive, held in a fake laboratory. The reaction was immediate. Lawyers, diplomats, and activists mobilized. Now the case wasn't just a journalistic matter, it had become a political one. Meanwhile, Tiago intensified his efforts to discredit Marina. Fake social media campaigns tried to paint the reporter as a manipulator working for foreign enemies. But the effect backfired. Each attack only strengthened her image as a courageous journalist standing up to a giant. Public opinion was divided, but the scales were tipping against the billionaire. Joaquim and his family were moved to a safe location. The boy didn't fully understand why he couldn't play in the park or go to school as usual. His worried mother explained they were protecting Grandpa Pedro. The boy accepted this, hugging the drawings as if they were his greatest shield against the world. On the other side, Tiago couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth in his penthouse, locked away, afraid even of his own security team. He began to distrust everyone, believing his own team would soon betray him. Paranoia ate away at his mind, and his public image was rapidly falling apart. The harassment of Marina culminated in a night of terror. 2 men broke into her apartment while she was out, destroying furniture and scrawling threatening messages on the walls. In red letters they wrote, "Final warning." When she returned, she trembled but took a deep breath. "There's no turning back now," she murmured. The news kept spreading, growing more forceful by the day.
The case had reached the UN, and world leaders were demanding a full investigation. Pedro's name had become a rallying cry for social movements calling for scientific freedom and corporate transparency. It seemed the entire world was against Tiago. Despite her fear, Marina felt strengthened. She had on her side not just documents, but the support of millions. Her greatest fear was what Tiago might do to Pedro before it was too late. Every second was precious. And so the pursuit intensified. But at the same time, the protective network around the truth grew stronger. Marina knew the fight was far from over. The final confrontation between the power of lies and the force of justice was still to come.
Tiago decided to face the press one more time. He called a grand press conference, trying to salvage his image. He entered the auditorium in an impeccable suit and a calculated smile. But the camera flashes weren't of admiration anymore. They were of suspicion. Journalists waited for him with sharp questions, and the tension in the air was palpable. A reporter stood up and displayed right in the middle of the live broadcast one of the photos of Pedro in the secret lab. "Mr. Lopez, can you explain how this man, missing for years, appears inside a facility owned by your company?" The silence that followed was deafening. Tiago's gaze froze in front of the crowd. He tried to laugh it off, calling it a grotesque fake, but his voice failed him. The camera zoomed in on the sweat dripping down his forehead, the nervousness in his eyes. The image broadcast to millions showed not a visionary leader, but a cornered man. The mask was visibly slipping. The press conference quickly turned into a battlefield. Journalists shouted questions, demanding answers. Tiago, increasingly flustered, contradicted himself with every sentence. Social media exploded in real time, comparing his statements to documented evidence. His collapse was inevitable. Meanwhile, executives from his own company began jumping ship. Several resigned from their positions, stating they did not want to be associated with criminal activity. Investors pulled their funds en masse. Within hours, the company's value plummeted on international stock markets. Tiago's empire was crumbling in real time. Backstage, Marina watched the press conference on television. She felt a mix of triumph and apprehension. She knew a powerful, desperate man was even more dangerous. Tiago wouldn't give up easily and might attempt extreme measures to escape, but his downfall was already etched into history. Cornered, the billionaire abruptly ended the conference. He was escorted out, ignoring the questions, his face pale and his eyes dazed. The image spread across the world, the man who claimed to be a savior, fleeing like a guilty criminal. The contrast was devastating. In his penthouse, Tiago smashed mirrors, screamed until he lost his voice, and blamed everyone around him. But deep down, he knew the truth had won. There were no more masks to wear, no more narratives to sustain. All that remained was to face the consequences. Marina, in silence, took a deep breath. The bottle was advancing, but one crucial thing remained: finding Pedro alive. Without him, justice would not be complete. The next step would be to rescue him from his prison. The world watched with attentive eyes. The unmasking of Tiago was not the end, but the prelude to an even greater confrontation. International pressure reached its peak when a coalition of governments demanded immediate access to Tiago's secret facilities. Under the threat of global sanctions, he could no longer hide his actions. Investigators, accompanied by security forces, stormed one of the complexes disguised as a research center. The world watched the live footage aired by international broadcasters.
Inside, the hallways were cold, lit by harsh artificial lighting that never saw the sun. Locked rooms held files, machinery, and confidential documents. But in one of them, behind reinforced doors, was Pedro. He looked older, with a graying beard and a frail body, and he stared in disbelief at the agents entering the room. For a moment, he couldn't believe it was real.
"Mr. Pedro Alvarez?" one of the investigators asked, extending a hand. The scientist replied in a weak voice, "It's me. I thought I'd never see the outside world again." Tears streamed down his tired face, a mix of relief and years of pent-up pain. After years of captivity, he was finally breathing the air of freedom. The news spread across the planet in seconds. Headlines blared, "Pedro Alvarez is alive." Crowds celebrated in the streets as Tiago's downfall became irreversible. The billionaire was now officially accused of kidnapping, scientific fraud, and crimes against humanity. There was no more room for doubt or manipulation. When Marina received the confirmation, she cried with emotion. She felt the weight of months of pursuit and threats transform into victory. "We did it! Grandpa Pedro is free!" she told the scientist's family, hugging them tightly. When Joaquim heard the news, he smiled radiantly and asked, "Can I see Grandpa now?" As Pedro was escorted to safety, the world heard his first public words in years. "Science should be a gift for everyone, not a weapon to enrich a few." His voice was weak but firm, echoing as a manifesto against greed. Even in his weakened state, he showed the same conviction that had made him a respected genius. When Tiago saw the footage, he exploded in rage. He broke objects, screamed at subordinates, and tried to arrange an immediate escape. But his movements were already being monitored by international authorities. The man once hailed as a savior was now being hunted as a criminal. Surrounded by doctors and journalists, Pedro tried to readjust to the free world. Every camera flash bothered him, but he understood the importance of his appearance. He was living proof that the truth always finds a way, even after years of forced silence. The reunion with his daughter and Joaquim grew closer. It was the most anticipated moment, not just for the family, but for the public. The human symbol at the heart of this story had become the soul of the struggle. And so, Pedro's liberation was not just a victory for one family. It was a victory of science over corruption, truth over lies, and justice over absolute power.
The reunion took place at an international hospital, surrounded by security. But to Pedro, none of that mattered. His eyes locked onto his daughter and his grandson, Joaquim, as they ran toward him. The scientist opened his trembling arms, and the three embraced in silence, crying intensely.
"Grandpa, I knew you'd come back," Joaquim said, clutching the drawings he carried. Pedro kissed the boy's forehead. "You're the one who brought me back." The purity of the scene stood in stark contrast to the darkness Tiago had tried to impose. Pedro's daughter gently touched his aged face. "I thought you were gone forever." He replied, "I never stopped fighting. You were my hope." Outside, crowds celebrated, waving flags with Pedro's face and demanding justice. Marina watched from a distance, allowing the family their moment. Later, Pedro thanked her personally. "You were my voice." Joaquim, not fully grasping the magnitude of his actions, proudly showed his grandfather the old drawings. The emotion of the reunion spread across the planet. News reports called it a historic moment. Meanwhile, Tiago watched the scene on a screen, furious. "They destroyed me with a hug," he muttered, planning his escape. Just days later, Pedro addressed the world from a simple auditorium. "The solar reactor belongs to humanity," he declared, presenting original documents that proved his authorship and exposed Tiago's manipulations. The room erupted in applause. His daughter, in the front row, wept. Joaquim, sitting on her lap, whispered, "It's Grandpa, the hero." Marina watched the press conference with relief. The impact was immediate. international organizations announced an alliance to develop the solar reactor collaboratively. Courts issued warrants for Tiago. As Pedro left, he was met by a crowd. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I just believed that science should serve life." Watching from a hideout, Tiago clenched his fists in hatred, knowing there was no way back. As Pedro won over the world, Tiago's empire crumbled. Stock prices plummeted, contracts were cancelled, and allies abandoned him. In his luxurious, now empty penthouse, he was a lonely man. The press showed no mercy, with new allegations emerging daily. Surrounded by whiskey bottles, he stared at his reflection. "I was a god. Now I'm a ghost." Justice moved swiftly. His assets were frozen, his accounts blocked. He attempted a clandestine escape, but was betrayed by his own henchmen and captured. His arrest was broadcast live. Informed of the capture, Pedro said, "I don't desire revenge, only justice." In court, Tiago was convicted of kidnapping, fraud, and crimes against humanity. Months later, the world had changed. The solar reactor, now a symbol of hope, was being tested globally, bringing clean energy to forgotten villages. Pedro, now recovered, supervised the project, insisting that the energy belongs to everyone. Joaquim was seen as the little hero of truth. On a quiet afternoon, Pedro walked with Joaquim in the park. The boy pointed to the streetlights. "Grandpa, the world is shining with your drawings." Pedro hugged him, moved. Marina watched the scene, knowing that it was the dawn of a future illuminated by cooperation. The legacy was clear. No lie can withstand the power of truth. An innocent child unmasked an empire of lies and restored hope to the world. Are you ready to hear more stories that prove the truth always wins? Then subscribe now and join our community for unforgettable, heart-stirring stories.